How do you handle it when your sin is so large, so embarrassing, so hidden, and it feels like God would never actually deal with you in a good way? We're going to dig into a story about exactly that. Today we are in 2 Samuel 11 and 12 and also 1 Chronicles 20.
Well, we're in 2 Samuel with a very, I would say, very well-known account of David and his poor choices, or one of his poor choices. But I think it's really interesting. Like, he finds Bathsheba while, like, all the men are out at war, and he wants her, so he gets her. But what is so interesting about this story, so, I don't know, I guess, give a little backstory. When he takes her, she becomes pregnant. The child that is, like, born to them gets sick and dies. In the meantime, David is, like, feeling so embarrassed by his sin that he basically tries to have the husband come back so that it looks like it's his child, but he refuses to go home. Like, he wants to be, like, this devout warrior. He doesn't want to be home. So David's like, well, I can't make it look like he's the father, so I guess I'll just send him out and kill him. So the husband of this woman is out, dies in battle, and David just kind of takes his wife then, I guess, anyway. But what's crazier to me about this story is that if not for this instance, we would also not be introduced to another character in the story, another son from David and Bathsheba, is Solomon, which is so crazy because he is an integral part to much of what we know about the temple and a lot of these other wisdom literature books. So it's also kind of crazy in that, because it's just like, man, why did he have to do that? But at the same time, had he not, parts of, like, biblical history would be obsolete.
Yeah, I do have a caution on had he not. There's plenty of people that see this as it's possible that God had always intended that David and Bathsheba be together, but not in this way, obviously. Obviously, there's a lot of different ways you could look at this story. A very real question is, well, Solomon is such a huge part of the worship of God in Israel. Solomon's going to build the temple. Solomon's going to be the wisest, known as the wisest king that ever lived. Solomon is going to oversee like a lot of the peace and riches of Israel, but Solomon is also going to completely lose his mind at the end of his life. And so Solomon is not this amazing character. He's super flawed, just like David is super flawed.
I was going to say, I'm not sure that's literally the case for anybody.
And it causes you to wrestle. I think that's probably a topic for a whole podcast on its own. It causes you to wrestle with, like, okay, so if God is in control, then how like, surely Solomon was not an accident. Mm-hmm. So if Solomon was always intended to be king of Israel, then how does this work? And that would kind of reveal what you believe about God's sovereignty in and of yourself and how you see the world. We'll dive into that at a different time, I think. But basically, we read the other day 2 Samuel 10, where Joab is leading the Israelites against the Ammonite armies. And so what the author is doing in 2 Samuel is he introduces that war with the Ammonites in 2 Samuel 10. And while the Israelites are fighting that war, David is supposed to be with him, but he's not. Mm-hmm. And so because David does not go where he's supposed to, he falls into sin. So you can make a list of many things that David does incorrectly. First of all, he's supposed to be at war. He doesn't go. Second of all, he's lusting after this woman from the roof of his house. He shouldn't be doing that. Third of all, he goes and basically, like, I mean, the text actually says, like, he took her.
Yeah.
He's a king. She's just some woman living down in the town. Like, that is not good. It's not. Obviously, they have this sexual relationship that's not okay. Then there's this premeditated murder to make sure Uriah dies. That's not okay. Then he's going to lie to Nathan the prophet. That's not okay. Like, the list just goes on and on and on and on.
But isn't it funny, though? Like, sin does that to us, and that's not unique to David at all. Like, how many times have we found ourselves, I mean, anybody, where one sin leads to another, and then before you know it, you're, like, wrapped up in this, like, awful place. And I think that speaks a lot to also not being, like, really in tune with God either, and having him as a, like, necessary, needed part of your day-to-day life. Because I think there's not really a whole lot of mention in this chapter at all of any reference to God or David seeking him out. It's funny, though, that once David kind of hits this low of lows when that baby is born, that is when he starts like dedicating a lot of his time fasting, praying to God. We were talking earlier how, so after that child, did they give it a name? Like, did we, is there, I don't think there
we're
is.
aware of a name, no.
Okay, well, anyway, when that baby becomes like incredibly sick and something is like very wrong with it, David kind of kicks it into full gear and is like, okay, I need to fast, I need to pray because I want this child to live. And we had talked a little bit about that earlier, because the outcome of that prayer and fasting was not what David wanted. And I think that speaks to us a little bit. I know I had tried fasting last week for the first time, and it is like, that is not an easy task for sure, and it requires a lot of discipline and like really focusing on prayer. And I think when you're in a situation like David's and you're fasting and praying and the results are not what you expect, that would be like very humbling.
There's a lot to be learned from this entire story, and actually it's funny how you can read through the full text of the Bible and you hit these lulls where it's like, I don't know, am I getting anything out of this? And then you hit like 2 chapters where it's like, oh my goodness, there's so much packed in here. So I do think the way that David handles God's judgment is really interesting. A lot of times the David and Bathsheba story, the sin gets a lot of attention and not the fallout. And so I do like that we're focusing more on the fallout. Basically, Nathan comes to David and confronts him. David owns up to what he's done, and God says, hey, like, I'm going to forgive you. I'm going to spare you. I'm not going to demand your life right now, but the sword will never depart from your family. So God makes a judgment that is violence will be part of your lineage now, which was not what God had said from the beginning. God had said that you would have this forever kingdom and peace would forever be with you if you listen to me. And so David did not listen to him. So now the sword is going to be part of his family. That does come true. We're going to see that as we read the narrative. He says that this child is not going to live. We see that happens. And David's response is really interesting because he goes straight to prayer. He fasts for 7 days. He's taking this so seriously that the servants are afraid to tell him what has happened because they're afraid of how he's going to act. So it's obvious that the servants at least thought David was praying in a way that he believed this child would be healed if that was what God wanted. So I do have some subtle thoughts on this issue. I know that there's a stream of Christianity that believes that God intends to heal you always. God intends to never have any kind of challenging things show up in your life. It seems like from this story that's not true. That doesn't seem like it's completely correct. From what we can tell, David is seeking the Lord with like complete fervor and complete belief. He's denying himself in a very extreme sense. He's fasting for 7 days. And God still demands the life of the child. So we should, when we deal with things, we should seek the Lord in prayer completely. We should believe that God will act in complete faith. But God doesn't always act the way that we tell him to, because if God always did what we said, we would be God and not him.
Right.
And so because God is God, he's in control, we're not. And ultimately this child dies. What's really interesting is the servants are afraid to tell David. When they tell David, he kind of discovers like, oh, it must have happened. So David gets up, he washes himself off, he goes in to God's presence and worships the Lord. He doesn't get furious that God didn't do what he wants. He doesn't fall into disbelief. He basically says, okay, God, like, that's what you wanted to do. I'm going to believe that that's what you wanted to do. I'm going to praise you and worship you. So it's really interesting. I think one of the core concepts here is that sin has consequences. God did forgive David for his sin, but David lived a harder life because of his sin. And I think also, like, we should always be driven to prayer, but maybe the Lord will not answer your prayer exactly how you think he should. And that doesn't mean he's not God.
Right. So what's your part for today's reading?
We started off talking about, like, how do you handle when you fail in a significant way? You own up to it. What's really cool is that God did not...
Fail meaning sin.
Yeah. When there is sin in your life, God actually says that they, like David, despised his law. And so when we do that, one, we should never strive to fall into sin in that way. But when you do, one of the things that is revealed here in this text is that God is gracious. He is compassionate. He does forgive us. The Bible is full of people with significant sin in their lives that God forgives. But there is consequences from our sin. And so sometimes the decisions that you've made that were sinful, you will repent and God will forgive you. That is always true. But it doesn't mean that you'll live consequence-free. So I think that David understood he was forgiven. I think that David understood that God did put difficult things in his life because of his sin, and I'm sure he regretted that. And it's the same in our lives today. You can think of times probably when God definitely forgave your sin, but you had to walk out real-life consequences because of that.
Yeah.
So, and I think that's because God is gracious, but he's also just. And so he wants us to strive for holiness, and when we miss the mark, there is forgiveness, but there is consequence. So I think just an encouragement to you, like, God is gracious, God is forgiving. Please don't ever hear me saying that you are too far from God. That is not true. I don't care what you've done or what you've fallen into. God will forgive your sin if you repent and turn to him. But you might deal with consequences of that sin as you work out the rest of your life. But God, in his grace, he makes a way for us. He provides for us. He cares for us. And so I just encourage you, if there is sin in your life, go to God for forgiveness, and then seek him for provision as you walk as a follower of Jesus. I think it's really important. So we'll be back again tomorrow. We're looking at the Psalms. So we'll see you then. Thanks so much for listening to God's Plan, Your Part. If anything stuck out to you, if you have any questions, or if you'd like to receive a Bible, you can email us at godsplанyourpart@gmail.com. Also, if you're enjoying the podcast, please consider supporting us through the link in our description. We love that you're on this journey with us, and we hope you have a great day. See you tomorrow.